And welcome back. I've always considered myself a reasonably good communicator. That may be because I have spent most of my life talking. After all, I am an attorney. But communicating is not the same as speaking. Perhaps because I speak three languages, none of them perfectly, and all of them with accents, I know that the same sentence can mean different things depending on who is hearing it. So you would think I would have learned by now that communication is not really about what I say. It's about what the other person hears. It's a lesson I learned while becoming a pilot and communicating with the tower or air traffic control. Yet it's a lesson that I had to learn again when I started taking sailing lessons. One of the mandatory classes for my sailing license is radio communication, where you are taught the rules and procedures, and that there are specific words that mean specific things. You don't simply grab the microphone and start chatting. Well, you could, but you are most likely to be misunderstood and be recognized as a new, or worse, a poor sailor. And yet, even when everyone is technically speaking the same language, communication can go wrong. A word is missed or a number is misunderstood. Someone assumes they know what you meant. Someone else hears something you never intended to say. And suddenly, two people are operating from two completely different versions of the same conversation. When that happens, my instinct is the obvious one. When someone misunderstands me, something that I said, I want to know what they had misunderstood. That seems reasonable. But then I started wondering whether that was actually the most useful question. Perhaps the better question is, why was I misunderstood? That is a very different question. The first placed the problem with the listener. The second put at least some responsibility back on me. And that distinction extends far beyond marine communication. Think about the last time someone misunderstood you. Perhaps you explained something carefully, only to discover that the other person had heard something completely different. Your first reaction was probably something along the lines of, "That's not what I said," or "That's not what I meant." And perhaps it wasn't. Because communication isn't math, where 1 plus 1 is always 2. The point isn't to establish that I said X and you somehow heard Y. The point is to get from what I intended to communicate to what you actually understood. Those are not always the same thing. This matters even more now because so much of our communication happens without the things that used to help us interpret one another. A text message has no tone of voice. An email has no facial expression. And no matter how many emojis or what emojis I insert in a text, the emotion that helps us understand the communication is absent. A comment can be read in a completely different mood from the one in which it was written. And of course, we increasingly communicate through machines that are remarkably good at producing words but have no human experience behind them. Which raises an interesting question. If communication is difficult enough face to face, what happens when we start relying on technology to interpret, translate, summarize, or even generate what we say? Perhaps the answer isn't to communicate more. Perhaps it is to communicate more deliberately. That doesn't mean choosing every word as though we were drafting a legal contract. It means recognizing that the person on the other end of the conversation doesn't have access to what is inside our head. They only have access to what we put outside of it. That sounds obvious, but remarkably, it isn't. We routinely assume that our intentions are somehow visible to the other people, when in fact, most of the time, they're not. I can be joking and sound cruel. I can be trying to help and sound patronizing. I can be trying to express concern and sound critical. I can be completely convinced that I have explained something clearly, while the person listening is thinking, what on earth is he talking about? And when that happens, my responsibility isn't necessarily to repeat myself louder. After all, the listener is not deaf. It may be to try saying it differently. There is another side to this too. Taking responsibility for communication doesn't mean accepting responsibility for every possible interpretation. We can be clear and still be misunderstood. We can choose our words carefully and still encounter someone determined to hear something else. There has to be a limit. Otherwise, communication becomes an impossible exercise in anticipating every thought, experience, prejudice, assumption, and emotional state of everyone who might hear us. So I'm not suggesting that every misunderstanding is the speaker's fault. I'm suggesting something less comfortable. When someone misunderstands us, perhaps our first question shouldn't always be, what's wrong with them? Perhaps occasionally it should be, what did I contribute to this? That is a much harder question, and I suspect a much more useful one. It also happens to be a pretty good principle for sailing. Out on the water, you don't get to win an argument with reality. If you misread the chart, the rock doesn't care that your interpretation seemed reasonable. If you misunderstand a radio instruction, the other boat doesn't care that you were certain you heard correctly. And if you give an ambiguous instruction to someone who is helping you maneuver a boat, it doesn't really matter that you knew what you meant. The boat only responds to what was communicated. Perhaps that's why I'm finding this particular lesson so valuable. Again, sailing has a wonderful way of turning abstract ideas into physical consequences. You can talk about responsibility all day. Then you take a 30-foot boat into a marina and discover that responsibility has a very literal meaning. You can talk about communication, then you pick up a radio and realize that somebody else has to understand you correctly, not approximately and not eventually, but correctly and now. And you begin to appreciate something I should probably have remembered. Being understood is partly my responsibility. Not entirely, but partly. Which leaves me with this week's question. The next time someone misunderstands you, will you be more interested in proving that you were clear in what you said, or in making sure that you were understood? Because those are two very different goals. And I'm beginning to think that only one of them actually qualifies as communication. Until next time, fair winds. Oh, by the way, I don't mean to make money off of this series. However, I have no input in what YouTube does. So if you have to put up with an ad, please know that it did not authorize it and that I do not receive any financial or other type of benefit from it. Till next time.